You're standing knee-deep in snow, 30 kilometers from Moscow. December 1941. The thermometer reads minus 38 degrees Celsius. Your fingers on the trigger long ago stopped being fingers. They're just wooden stumps you no longer feel. A red flare bursts in the sky above you and someone behind yells something about a retreat. You don't move. You stare at the distant lights of Moscow's suburbs and think of one thing. Kurt said he'd be home by Christmas. Kurt has been gone for 27 days. My name is Werner Hoffmann, 24 years old. Munich, Kaufingerstrasse, 4th floor, where my mother still dries laundry on a line strung between the windows. I'm a supply specialist, a lance corporal in the 87th Infantry Division, and in September 1941, I rode east in a freight car, genuinely believing this was the final push, that in 3 weeks, it would all be over, that the Russians were broken. Our company commander, First Lieutenant Gross, told us this confidently, map in hand. Look, here's Moscow. Here we are. Here's the arrow of our advance. Nothing left. We laughed and cooked canned food over a fire. This was Operation Typhoon. Hitler signed the directive on October 2nd. Army Group Center. 1.5 million men, 1,700 tanks, 14,000 artillery pieces, 950 aircraft. It was the most powerful ground operation in human history up to that point. The plan was to take Moscow in 6 weeks, annihilate the Soviet armies on the approaches, close the pincers, and enter the capital in a triumphant parade. Everything was scheduled by the day. Gross showed us. We'll be here on the 15th, here on the 20th. On October 15th, we got stuck in the mud near Maloyaroslavets, and it wasn't just mud. It was a living black sludge that devoured equipment like a hungry swamp. General Mud. That's what German newspapers would later write when they needed to justify the failure. It was laughable. October in Russia is always like that. No one bothered to account for it. Kurt Lange was from Dresden, a cheerful idiot with reddish eyebrows and a habit of whistling something resembling Bach at the most inappropriate moments. We met in Poland in 1940 at a training camp near Breslau. He managed to accidentally shoot the cook then, a ricochet, a bullet into a pot of pea soup. No one was hurt, but the cook didn't speak for a week. Lange, you're a genius, Sergeant Major Brower told him then. It was a joke, but Kurt took it seriously and from then on walked around as if he really was something special. Near Vyazma in early October, we captured Soviet prisoners, about 150,000 in 3 days in 2 encirclements. It seemed like a victory, after which everything would be over. We watched columns of ragged Russian soldiers marching west and thought, it's over. There's no one left to defend Moscow. Gross pulled out his map again. Another arrow. Another 3 weeks. We laughed again. Werner, do you think there's beer in Moscow? Kurt asked then, chewing a hardtack biscuit. There's kvass, I said. What's kvass? I don't know, but it sounds bad. That was the last normal conversation I remember having with him. On November 3rd, the frost struck, minus 15 degrees Celsius overnight, without warning. We had no winter uniforms. They hadn't been supplied because, according to the plan, the war was supposed to end in October. That was the plan. I wrapped my feet in newspapers. Russian newspapers with Stalin's portrait, the only thing I could find. One of our guys said it was symbolic. We didn't laugh. We no longer had the strength. Our company had 112 men on October 1st. By November 20th, 67. Not just from Soviet bullets, frostbite, dysentery, pneumonia. Staff Corporal Muller lost 3 fingers on his right hand. He simply didn't notice until he took off his glove. Dr. Reinhold, our company medic, amputated more that week than in the entire previous year. He worked with a look on his face as if he'd long stopped understanding why he was doing it. Kurt left on the morning of November 5th. He just went out to check a position by the cops. They'd heard something there during the night, rustling, snapping twigs. He took Franz Weber with him. 20 minutes later, Franz returned alone, pale as a ghost. He sat on an ammunition crate, stared at the ground, and remained silent for a long time. Where's Lange? Gross asked. Sniper, Franz said. Just one word. nothing more. We later found Kurt at the edge of the copse. He lay on his side and the snow around him was already dark. His trophy cigarette case, the one with the engraving KN 1938, lay nearby in the snow. I picked it up, held it for a minute, then threw it back. I don't know why. I just didn't want to see it. Gross recorded in the log. Lange Kurt, Corporal, May 11th, 1941. Combat losses. 8 words. All that remained of the red-haired Dresden native who whistled Bach and once shot a hole in a soup pot. The Soviet sniper took 2 more that day, from the 3rd platoon. No one found him. He operated somewhere from the forest, from a distance our men couldn't cover. Gross requested artillery. The artillery didn't respond because most of the guns had already seized up by then. The oil in the mechanisms had frozen, and special winter oil hadn't been supplied. For the same reason, winter greatcoats hadn't been supplied. The offensive on Moscow proceeded in 3 phases. The first, October, when it seemed imminent. The second, November, when we entered Klin, took Solnechnogorsk, and approached the Moscow Canal. On December 5th, the forward elements of the 258th Division, they say, saw the Kremlin towers through binoculars. They saw them, that's important, because they didn't advance any further, not a single meter, because on December 6th, the Russians struck back. At that moment, I was in the village of Krasnaya Polyana, 27 kilometers from Moscow, the closest point we reached in the entire operation. The village was empty, the houses frozen solid, not a single living chicken. Franz Weber and I sat in some barn, burning a wooden fence inside, breathing smoke and not moving, because moving was unbearable. Ever since he lost Kurt, Franz hadn't spoken normally. He answered questions but never initiated conversation. He just sat and stared into the fire. "How long do you think this will last?" I asked him then. "I don't know," Franz said. "Do you want to go home?" "Yes." "Do you think we'll make it back?" He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I will return." There was no certainty in his voice. It was just a wish, spoken aloud so as not to go mad. On December 6, 1941, Soviet forces launched a counterattack along the entire front line. Under Zhukov's command, 35 divisions, dozens of brigades, hundreds of T-34 tanks, which our panzers struggled to cope with in winter conditions. We didn't expect it. German intelligence reported that the Soviets had no reserves, that they were exhausted, clinging to their last breath. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Stalin had transferred fresh divisions from the Far East, 28 formations, about 200,000 men, properly dressed, well-armed, accustomed to the frost. They emerged from behind the front line as if from nowhere. The order for retreat in our company arrived on December the 7th around 3 in the morning. Gross read it by flashlight, standing knee-deep in snow, his hand trembling, whether from the cold or something else. "Organized withdrawal to new defensive lines," he read aloud. "Maintaining unit combat effectiveness is a priority." "It's a retreat," said Brower, our sergeant major. "An organized withdrawal," Gross repeated and put the paper back in his map case. "As you say, Herr First Lieutenant." We retreated, along the same road we had advanced, only now to our right, a village was burning, and behind us, shots rang out. I carried a wounded man on my shoulders, Peter Schultz from the 2nd platoon, whose thigh had been torn open by shrapnel. He was heavy, about 80 kilograms, and silent the whole way, only occasionally hissing something unprintable through clenched teeth. We covered 21 kilometers that night. When dawn broke, Peter was dead. He had simply frozen solid on my shoulders. I didn't realize it immediately. I reached the assembly point, propped him against a wall, and only then saw from his face that it was over. Dr. Reinhold looked, nodded, wrote something in his notebook. He asked me, "How are you?" I said, "Fine." He looked at my hands, took my wrists, and began to rub my fingers. It didn't hurt. That was a bad sign. "Second-degree frostbite," he said matter-of-factly. "You won't lose your fingers, but it's better not to work with a weapon for a week." I didn't laugh. I just nodded. By the end of December, we had fallen back 100 kilometers from Moscow. Hitler relieved Field Marshal von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, and 35 other generals of their duties. For failure, for retreat, for daring to report the true state of affairs. Von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the army, suffered a heart attack and resigned. Hitler personally took command. Personally. A man who hadn't fought since World War I and had never commanded anything larger than a company was now leading army groups on a 2,000-kilometer front. This was the beginning of the end, but we didn't know it yet. In the entire Operation Typhoon from October to December 1941, the German side lost about 500,000 men, killed, wounded, frostbitten, or captured. 500,000. For comparison, during the entire French campaign in 1940, 45,000, a difference of 11 times. Our 87th Division entered the operation at full strength, about 15,000 men. By January 1942, fewer than 3,000 were combat effective. This wasn't a defeat. It was molten metal from which nothing more could be forged. Franz Weber, who said, "I will return." He did return. He was wounded in February near Rzef, hospitalized in Minsk, then Berlin. He got home in May 1942. I know this because he wrote a letter to Gross, and Gross read it aloud to us. Franz wrote that he was glad to be living in Dresden, the same city Kurt Lange was from. Gross didn't comment on it. He simply folded the letter and put it back in his map case next to the retreat order. Gross died near Stalingrad in November 1942. Brauer, there too. Dr. Reinhold was captured in 43 and returned to Germany in 51, 8 years later, alive, with white hair and a quiet voice. I met him once in Munich in 55, by chance, at the market. He was buying apples. We recognized each other, shook hands, stood in silence for a minute. Then he said, "How are the fingers?" I showed him, all still there. He nodded. We never saw each other again. In December 41, as we retreated from Moscow under Russian attacks, I saw our supply depots burning to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Everything burned. Ammunition, canned goods, bales of winter uniforms that were never issued to us because they were being transported behind the advancing troops for the victory parade. Winter greatcoats burned in kilometer-long warehouses on that November night. We walked past, silently watching the fire. One of the soldiers, I don't remember who, a fresh, very young recruit, suddenly said, "They're burning us." No one answered him, because he was right. Moscow was not taken, never taken. After December 41, German troops never again came so close to the Soviet capital. 27 kilometers, that was the maximum. That was all those who saw the Kremlin towers through binoculars saw before they died in the snow, without taking another step. An operation planned for 6 weeks turned into 4 years of slow, agonizing, bloody retreat. The path led through Stalingrad, through Kursk, through Warsaw, all the way to Berlin, where in May 45, Soviet soldiers raised their banner over the Reichstag. I look at my hands now, all 10 fingers with small white spots on the skin from the frostbite of 41 that never quite faded. Reinhold was right. My fingers remained. Not for everyone. Muller lived his whole life with 3 fingers. Kurt Lang stayed in the snow under a birch copse 5 kilometers from the village of Kresnaya Polyana, without his cigarette case, without Bach, without Christmas. 30 kilometers to Moscow. We never got closer. It couldn't get any colder. And then, it was just over.